Thanks for tuning in to Crazy Manga Stories. Give a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell for more betrayal stories. The evening was quiet as Ethan sat in his modest suburban living room, his fingers absent-mindedly tapping against the armrest of his chair. Outside, the cicadas droned a rhythmic hum, a sound he usually found soothing, but tonight it grated on his nerves. The world beyond the window seemed calm, yet inside his chest, a storm brewed. He stared at the glowing screen of his laptop, the cursor blinking mockingly on an empty search bar. For weeks, Ethan had dismissed the little things, subtle changes in Lauren's behavior, fleeting glimpses of unease in her eyes, excuses that felt too polished. Lauren, his wife of 12 years, had always been vivacious, her laughter filling every room with warmth. Recently, though, her laughter had grown hollow, her warmth distant. Ethan told himself he was overthinking it, but then came the social events she attended without him. She'd always been the life of the party, but these gatherings seemed different. "Just the neighbors," she'd say, her tone light but evasive. He exhaled sharply and leaned forward, opening the browser and typing, "How to know if your spouse is cheating." His heart sank as he scrolled through the list of signs. Many of them mirrored Lauren's behavior: sudden attention to her appearance, unexplained absences, and a guarded phone. He hated himself for even entertaining the thought, but he hated the gnawing doubt even more. The sound of the front door opening jolted him from his thoughts. Lauren stepped inside, her cheeks flushed, her red hair damp from the evening's humidity. She carried the scent of roses and wine, the unmistakable markers of another neighborhood party. She smiled at him, her expression almost too bright. "You're still up?" she asked, setting her purse on the counter. Ethan, forced to smile, couldn't sleep. Work stress? Something like that. His eyes lingered on her for a moment too long, catching the flicker of discomfort in her gaze. Her gaze "I'm exhausted," she said, stretching theatrically. "Good night, Ethan." "Good night," he replied, watching her ascend the stairs, her silhouette fading into the shadows of their bedroom hallway. End quote. Once she was out of sight, Ethan turned back to his laptop. He clicked on a bookmarked site and logged into a secure server he'd set up earlier that evening. Surveillance wasn't something he'd ever imagined resorting to, but the time for doubt had passed. He accessed the new app he'd installed on Lauren's phone earlier that day, its icon cleverly disguised as a shopping app. A wave of nausea hit him as he navigated the app's interface, now filled with transcripts of her recent texts. He skimmed the messages, his sharp green eyes scanning for something definitive. Then he saw it. A string of texts to Mark, their seemingly innocuous neighbor. His heart sank further as he read their exchange. "Please, they just drifted into a much more detailed argument. Mark, you looked amazing tonight. Wish we didn't have to keep this quiet. Lauren, patience, Mark. All good things take time, Mark. I can't wait until we don't have to sneak around." Ethan closed the laptop, his jaw tightening. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. His mind raced with questions, fears, and a rising anger that chilled him to the bone. This wasn't a betrayal he could confront with half-truths or accusations met with denials. If he was going to confront Lauren, he needed irrefutable evidence. Tomorrow, he decided, he would install a hidden camera at the next gathering. Lauren had always claimed these parties were harmless. It was time to see what really went on. When the wine flowed and the lights dimmed, the truth was out there, and Ethan would uncover it, no matter the cost. Ethan woke up the next morning feeling as though he hadn't slept at all. The events of the previous night replayed in his mind like a broken record. He tried to focus on the familiar rhythm of his morning routine, showering, dressing, making coffee. But everything felt distant, automatic. Lauren had already left for her yoga class by the time he came downstairs. A bittersweet reminder of the woman he thought he knew. As he sipped his coffee, Ethan stared out the kitchen window. The neat rows of suburban houses seemed almost surreal in their perfection, each one hiding lives as complicated as his own. His gaze drifted to the house next door, where Mark lived. Mark, the affable neighbor who always volunteered to help at block parties, the man who never missed an opportunity to chat about sports or offer advice on landscaping. Ethan clenched his jaw. Was it all a facade? A way to stay close to Lauren without arousing suspicion? The thought was like a splinter, burrowing deeper with every passing minute. He needed more. Last night's discovery was damning, but it wasn't enough. If he confronted Lauren now, she could twist the truth, claim it was innocent flirtation, or worse, accuse him of invading her privacy. He couldn't let her turn the tables on him, not yet. After breakfast, Ethan went to the garage and retrieved a small box from the top shelf, dusting it off as he carried it to the dining table. Inside were the tools of a man who had once tinkered with technology as a hobby. A tiny, inconspicuous camera, barely larger than a button, and a set of adhesive strips. He hadn't touched the camera in years, but today it felt like his only lifeline. He spent the next hour testing the device, ensuring the footage was clear and the audio crisp. It would have to be perfect. Lauren's next neighborhood gathering was scheduled for that evening, a casual wine and cheese night hosted by Victoria. Ethan had never paid much attention to these events, dismissing them as harmless social rituals. Now he saw them in a different light. Opportunities for secrecy, for deceit, for betrayal. When Lauren returned from yoga, she seemed unusually cheerful, her eyes bright and her movements light. "Victoria's party starts at 7, she said, leaning against the counter. "You should come this time. Everyone would love to see you." Ethan forced a smile, his heart thudding in his chest. Was this an olive branch or a test? "Maybe," he said non-committally. "Depends on how work goes." The door opened and Commissioner Gretel came in. Lauren didn't push him, but her casual shrug and quick exit to the shower left him uneasy. Was she relieved he might not attend? Did she need him out of the way? By 6 o'clock, Ethan had a plan. He feigned a late work meeting, kissing Lauren goodbye as she left for the party, her dress a little too polished for a neighborhood gathering. As soon as her car disappeared down the street, he grabbed the camera and slipped out the back door. The night was warm, the suburban street bathed in soft golden light. He moved quickly but cautiously, sticking to the shadows as he made his way to Victoria's backyard. The house was bustling with activity, laughter and clinking glasses spilling out into the night. He crept to the side of the house, his heart pounding as he attached the camera to a discreet spot near the patio door, angling it to capture the backyard and living room. Satisfied, he retreated to the safety of his own home, his nerves on edge as he waited for the camera's feed to sync to his laptop. Minutes ticked by like hours before the screen lit up with the live footage. He watched as Lauren greeted Mark with a warmth that stung, her hand lingering on his arm as they laughed at something he said. Around them, neighbors mingled, oblivious to the undercurrent of intimacy between the two. Ethan's stomach churned as the evening unfolded. Mark leaned in too close. Lauren didn't pull away. When she glanced around to ensure no one was looking, Ethan knew. They were hiding something. The footage blurred as Ethan's vision clouded with anger. He paused the video and leaned back in his chair, his hands trembling. He felt trapped, as though the walls of his home were closing in. The people he had trusted, his wife, his neighbors, were no longer who they seemed. He was living in a world of masks, and every smiling face now felt like a potential betrayal. But Ethan wasn't ready to confront Lauren, not yet. Tonight's footage was a start, but it wasn't enough. He needed more. A moment so undeniable, so raw, that she couldn't twist her way out of it. And as much as he hated the thought, he realized the truth. This was just the beginning. Ethan awoke the next morning with a tight knot in his chest, the weight of the previous night pressing heavily on him. The live footage from Victoria's party had played on a loop in his mind, every frame seared into his memory. The casual intimacy between Lauren and Mark was undeniable, but it was Victoria's knowing glance that haunted him most. The betrayal seemed to spread like a poison, implicating not just Lauren and Mark, but the very fabric of his community. Was everyone in on the secret? Had they all smiled in his face while whispering behind his back? He couldn't let his anger consume him, not yet. That morning, as Lauren hummed in the kitchen slicing fruit for her breakfast, Ethan forced himself to act normal. He sat at the table, sipping his coffee, the aroma doing little to steady his nerves. "You really should have come last night," Lauren said, glancing at him with a playful smile. "Everyone missed you. Victoria asked about you, and Mark mentioned your new project at work. He thinks it sounds fascinating." Ethan's hand gripped the mug tighter, the ceramic cool against his skin. He managed a smile, though it felt brittle. "Work kept me tied up. Maybe next time." Her casual mention of Mark felt like a barb, deliberate and cruel, though Ethan knew that might just be his paranoia talking. He watched as she moved about the kitchen, her movements light and unburdened. Did she feel no guilt, no hesitation? Or had she convinced herself that her actions were somehow justified? Ethan's phone vibrated on the table, jolting him from his thoughts. A text from Jake, their neighbor and one of the few people Ethan still felt he could trust. "Need to talk. Meet me in the garage after Lauren leaves." Jake, a friendly, easygoing guy who always seemed to know more than he let on. Ethan replied with a curt, "On my way," and waited impatiently for Lauren to grab her bag and head out the door for her yoga class. As soon as her car disappeared down the street, Ethan slipped out of the house and made his way to Jake's detached garage. The space smelled faintly of sawdust and motor oil, the kind of place where secrets could be safely discussed. Jake was leaning against his workbench, arms crossed, his usually cheerful face etched with worry. "You've been watching, haven't you?" Jake asked, his voice low. Ethan stiffened, the question catching him off guard. "What are you talking about?" Jake exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Come on, Ethan. I saw you sneaking around last night, setting up that camera at Victoria's place. I've had my suspicions for a while, and if you're going down this road, I think you need to hear what I've got to say." Mounting the steps to the landing, Ethan's heart raced. "You know something?" Jake nodded grimly. "I do. Look, I've kept my mouth shut because this kind of thing is messy, and it's not my place. But seeing you there last night, I figured you were ready to face the truth." Jake motioned for Ethan to follow him deeper into the garage, where he pulled out an old laptop. "This is from a few months ago," he said, clicking through folders until he opened a video file. The footage was from a neighborhood barbecue at Mark's house. Ethan recognized the setting immediately. It had been a lively afternoon, with kids running through sprinklers and adults clustered around the grill. But the scene Jake showed him wasn't from the front yard. It was from the side of the house, partially obscured by hedges. Lauren and Mark stood close together, their heads tilted in what seemed like an intimate conversation. Then Mark's hand brushed her arm, lingering there longer than necessary. "That's not all," Jake said, opening another file. "This one was taken at a community meeting, a gathering Ethan had skipped because of work." Lauren sat beside Mark, her body angled toward him, her smile radiant. At one point, when she thought no one was looking, her hand drifted under the table and rested briefly on his knee. He closed his eyes and fought down the memories coming up. Ethan's chest tightened. The small gestures, the fleeting touches. These were the kinds of things people only noticed when they were looking for them. And Jake had been looking. "Ooh, didn't you tell me?" Ethan asked, his voice strained. Jake sighed, closing the laptop. "Because it wasn't my business. And honestly, I didn't know how bad it was. I thought maybe I was imagining things. But after last night, Ethan, I think you deserve to know the full picture. Ethan nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He didn't know whether to feel grateful or furious that Jake had kept this from him for so long. He turned his head to glare down at several copies of what looked to be maps of Paris last year, and tried to fuse the idea. Back at home, Ethan replayed the new footage alongside the recordings from the party. Together, they painted a damning portrait of Lauren's betrayal. But they also raised questions. Why had Jake been so willing to help? Was he truly on Ethan's side, or was there more to his involvement than he was letting on? The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but they didn't yet form a complete picture. Ethan knew he needed to tread carefully. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about Lauren and Mark. There were layers to this deception, threads connecting people he hadn't yet considered. That night, as Lauren sat beside him on the couch, scrolling through her phone, Ethan forced himself to act normal. He knew the truth now, or at least part of it. But he wasn't ready to confront her, not yet. First, he needed to uncover every secret, expose every lie. Because once he confronted Lauren, there would be no going back. Ethan's world had become a fragile balancing act. Each day he wore the mask of a devoted husband, while every fiber of his being ached to confront Lauren. The recordings, the texts, and now Jake's revelations had confirmed what he'd feared. Lauren's betrayal was real. Yet, the longer he watched, the more Ethan realized he wasn't just uncovering a simple affair. This was deeper, more calculated. The next step was both necessary and painful. Ethan needed definitive proof of Lauren and Mark's intentions, something he could use to not only confront her, but to protect himself when the time came. He knew the confrontation would shatter their lives, and when it did, he wanted to be prepared for every possible outcome. That morning, Ethan called in sick to work, his voice hoarse and subdued as he explained to his boss that he had caught a bug. In reality, he wasn't sick, just consumed by the need to uncover the full extent of Lauren's deceit. With Lauren at her yoga class and the house empty, Ethan settled into his home office and opened his laptop. The camera feed from the party was still saved on his device, but now he wanted more context. Ethan had installed the app on Lauren's phone, but he hadn't yet delved into the depths of its data. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the keyboard. Part of him still felt guilt for invading her privacy, but that feeling was quickly overridden by a wave of anger. If she had nothing to hide, there would be nothing to find. The app had synced her call logs and message history to a secure folder, and Ethan began scrolling. Most of the texts were mundane, chats with friends, reminders for errands. But his gut told him there was more. As he filtered the conversations, he saw a thread labeled simply Mark. The messages began innocently enough. Discussions about neighborhood events, light banter. Then, as the months progressed, the tone shifted. For only 6 weeks until his death, Mitchell received the ability to write, and he spent his days studying and writing. Mark, are you sure Ethan won't be there tonight? Lauren, he's working late again. He doesn't suspect a thing. Mark, perfect. I've been dying to get you alone. Lauren, me too. You know how to make a girl feel alive. Ethan's hand trembled as he read the exchange. The timestamps were damning, aligning with nights Lauren had claimed to be at casual gatherings or running errands. He scrolled further, his eyes narrowing as the messages became more suggestive, more intimate. Then he hit something chilling. Mark, when are you going to tell him? More. Not yet. I need more time to figure out the finances. We have to be smart about this. Finances? Ethan's stomach churned. Was Lauren planning to leave him? And what did she mean by figure out the finances? Ethan's mind raced. He needed to know more about their plans, about what Lauren and Mark were conspiring to do, and to find out, he would have to push the boundaries of what he thought he was capable of. He spent the next hour poring over their financial records, accessing joint accounts Lauren rarely touched. Most of the transactions were typical, but then he noticed an unusual charge from the week prior, a large withdrawal from their savings, made without his knowledge. It wasn't enough to cripple them, but it was significant. Lauren had always been careful with money. Why would she suddenly need thousands of dollars in cash? The official report said the more Ethan looked, the more discrepancies he found. Small purchases at stores he didn't recognize, charges to restaurants where they'd never eaten together. He even found an Airbnb reservation for a lakeside cabin made under Lauren's account. The dates matched one of her claimed girls' trips from a month ago. Ethan's breath quickened. It was no longer a question of if Lauren was cheating. It was about how far she was willing to go to cover her tracks. That evening, Ethan was careful not to let his tension show. Lauren returned home cheerful as ever, setting the table for dinner while humming a tune. "Jake invited us over for drinks this weekend," she said casually. "It'll be nice to catch up with everyone." "Sounds great," Ethan replied, his voice steady. Inside, though, his mind was churning. Jake's garage conversation had hinted that others in the neighborhood might know more than they were letting on. What secrets would come out if Ethan showed up with a few pointed questions? Why hadn't Jake made it clear that he was hoping to talk to Jason alone? The next day, Ethan acted on his suspicions. He visited the bank where Lauren had withdrawn the cash, asking for a record of their recent transactions. The teller hesitated, mentioning privacy policies, but Ethan leaned on their shared account status to get the information he needed. The withdrawal had been made in person, and the receipt included a note. "Private legal consultation." Ethan's heart sank. Legal consultation? Was Lauren preparing for divorce? Or was she securing assets for a life with Mark? The possibilities swirled in his mind, each one darker than the last. After several seconds, he braced himself for the next awful discovery. The Environmental Working Group was found guilty of conspiring to prevent the wildfire in Lake Tahoe. The final piece of the puzzle came later that night when Ethan checked the camera feed once more. Lauren had gone out for errands, but was at Mark's house. The camera captured her standing too close to him on the porch, their hands brushing in a way that was far too intimate. They spoke in hushed tones, their body language tense. Ethan couldn't hear their words, but the implications were clear. They were planning something. Ethan shut the laptop with trembling hands, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. He had enough now to confront Lauren, to lay everything bare. But as much as he wanted to storm into the room and demand answers, he knew he couldn't act rashly. This wasn't just about the betrayal. It was about his dignity, his future, and the careful dismantling of the web of lies that had ensnared his life. Ethan wasn't going to let Lauren walk away unscathed. But he would wait, because when the time came, the confrontation would be final, and the truth would leave no room for escape. This was a matter deep. Ethan spent the next few days in a state of eerie calm. He went about his daily routine as though everything were normal, but his mind worked tirelessly, replaying every clue, every betrayal, every thread of evidence he'd uncovered. The anger that had once burned hot had now cooled into something far more dangerous: resolve. He wasn't just angry anymore. He was determined. By Friday night, Ethan had prepared everything. The footage from his camera, the text messages, the financial records, and even the receipts from the bank were neatly organized on his laptop and ready to be revealed. The final act would take place during the neighborhood meeting Lauren had insisted they attend. Ethan had agreed without hesitation, knowing that it would be the perfect stage for his plan. As the evening approached, Lauren flitted around the house, dressing in a figure-hugging black dress, her usual charm on full display. "I'm so glad you're coming tonight," she said, fastening her earrings in front of the hallway mirror. "It'll be nice to show everyone how solid we are." Ethan's stomach twisted at her casual audacity, but he kept his expression neutral. "Of course," he replied, his tone even. The meeting was held in Victoria's expansive living room, where the neighborhood regularly gathered for events. The atmosphere was lively as couples chatted, glasses of wine in hand. Mark was already there, his easy smile and relaxed posture making Ethan's blood boil. He watched from across the room as Mark's eyes briefly met Lauren's, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. Sing fountains sat open a few feet away. Ethan bided his time, mingling just enough to avoid suspicion but keeping his focus on Lauren and Mark. As the meeting transitioned from casual conversation to discussions about neighborhood business, Ethan saw his opportunity. "Before we move on to the next topic," Ethan said, standing from his seat, "I'd like to share something with everyone." End quote. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him. Lauren's expression shifted, a trace of nervousness creeping in as she looked at him. She admitted, "Yes, I act on occasion. Over the past few weeks I've noticed some troubling patterns," Ethan began, his voice steady but commanding. "I realize that not everything in our community, or even in my own home, is what it seems." Lauren shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her smile faltering. Mark's confidence seemed to waver as well, his posture stiffening. Ethan pulled out his laptop and connected it to the television in the room, which Victoria had earlier used for a slideshow. He opened the folder containing the surveillance footage. "I've been gathering some evidence," he continued, his tone sharp, "and I think it's time everyone sees the truth." The first video played, showing Lauren and Mark at Victoria's party, their secretive touches and intimate glances captured in damning clarity. Gasps rippled through the room as neighbors exchanged shocked looks. Lauren froze, her face pale. "Ethan, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Exposing the truth," he said coldly, clicking to the next file. A series of text messages between Lauren and Mark, detailing their plans and deceit. The room grew even quieter, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Mark stood abruptly, his face flushed. "This is private," he snapped. Merrick reached for the screen. "So was my marriage," Ethan shot back, his voice rising. "You both made it public the moment you turned it into a spectacle of lies and betrayal." "No." Lauren stood too, her eyes pleading. "Ethan, please, let's talk about this privately. Don't do this here." Ethan shook his head. "No, you've had plenty of time to talk. I gave you trust, loyalty, and 12 years of my life. You gave me lies." Mr. Thorne sipped his coffee, the hard texture smooth and pleasant in his mouth. Turning back to the crowd, he added, "But it doesn't end with just these two. I've come to realize that some of you knew about this." His gaze landed on Victoria, whose face flushed with guilt. "You, Victoria. You knew, didn't you?" "The girls were," Victoria stammered, unable to meet his eyes. "Rude." "And yet," Ethan continued, his voice filled with quiet fury, "you all smiled in my face, let me walk around like a fool, while this mockery played out behind my back." The weight of his words seemed to settle over the room, leaving an uncomfortable silence in its wake. Lauren's tears began to fall, but Ethan felt no sympathy. "This is over," he said firmly, turning to Lauren. "Our marriage, your lies, all of it. It's done." He pulled a manila envelope from his jacket and handed it to her. "These are divorce papers. I suggest you read them carefully. I've already consulted a lawyer, and you'll find that the financial records I uncovered work heavily in my favor. You won't be getting the fresh start you thought you'd have with Mark." Mark opened his mouth to speak, but Ethan cut him off with a glare. "Don't. You've said enough with your actions." Ethan gathered his things and turned toward the door, addressing the room one last time. "If there's one thing I've learned, it's that betrayal thrives in silence. You all helped it thrive. I hope you'll remember this moment the next time you think about turning a blind eye." Ethan looked first to Patrice to silence the two of them. Without another word, he walked out, his head held high. As Ethan stepped into the cool night air, he felt the weight on his chest begin to lift. For the first time in weeks, he could breathe. The path ahead would be painful, but it would also be his own. He'd faced the truth, no matter how ugly, and reclaimed his dignity in the process. That, he realized, was the first step toward healing.